Welcome to EduPaths, helping educators navigate their professional growth. These materials were developed under a grant awarded by the Michigan Department of Education. Welcome to today's session, An Introduction to Vocabulary. My name is Jen McDonald, and I'll be your course instructor today. Vocabulary is defined as the words we must know to communicate effectively, which sounds simple enough. However, vocabulary is actually much more complex than that, and certainly of particular interest across the country due to its importance as one of the 6 fundamental shifts needed in English language arts instruction to help students fully engage in learning the Common Core state standards. We can think of vocabulary as having 2 components. Oral vocabulary are the words that we use in speaking or recognize in listening. And reading vocabulary are the words we recognize in print. While different, these 2 components are actually closely related. According to the National Reading Panel, a reader who encounters a strange word in print can decode the word to speech. If it is in the reader's oral vocabulary, the reader will be able to understand it. If the word is not in the reader's oral vocabulary, the reader will have to determine the meaning by other means, if possible. Consequently, the larger the reader's vocabulary, either oral or print, the easier it makes it to make sense of text. As teachers, we can look to 4 different types of vocabulary to guide our thinking about this important topic. Listening vocabulary is the words we need to know to understand what we hear. Speaking vocabulary is the words we use when we speak. Reading vocabulary is the words we use when we read. And writing vocabulary, these are the words we use in writing. All of these different types of vocabulary are important and inform our relationships with each of these skills: listening, speaking, reading, as well as writing. So why is vocabulary so important? Beginning readers use their oral vocabulary to make sense of the words they see in print. And readers must know what most of the words mean before they can understand what they're reading. If the ultimate goal of reading is comprehension, then vocabulary most certainly plays a critical role. Per the National Reading Panel report in 2000, quote, "The importance of vocabulary knowledge has long been recognized in the development of reading skills. As early as 1924, researchers noted that growth in reading power means continuous growth in word knowledge." Whipple, 1925. And in case you're counting out there, folks, that's 91 years of research. And what does this research tell us about vocabulary instruction? Children learn the meanings of most words indirectly through everyday experiences, through oral and written language. However, some vocabulary must be directly taught. Indirect vocabulary learning is when students learn vocabulary indirectly when they hear or see words used in many different contexts. For example, through conversations with adults, singing and saying nursery rhymes, being read to, and through reading extensively on their own. But the sad fact is, there are children that come from language-impoverished homes, and they are more likely to have a diminished vocabulary, thus creating a learning gap that may exist on the very first day of school for some children. Direct vocabulary learning is when students learn vocabulary directly, when they are explicitly taught both individual words and word learning strategies. Direct vocabulary instruction significantly aids reading comprehension. So let's take a closer look at direct vocabulary learning. There are 2 types of direct vocabulary instruction. There is specific word instruction, and there are word learning strategies. Here's an example of using specific word instruction. Let's say you have an upcoming unit on the United States government, and you want to pre-teach your students some of the key vocabulary words they might encounter, such as democracy, legislator, or Congress. When you're using word learning strategies, you might teach students about the concept of root words and prefixes and suffixes as a way to figure out unknown words such as truthful or injustice. Now it's time for activity number 1 in our module. Please pause the video and find activity number 1 below. When you have completed this task, please press play. But why do we teach specific words if most words are learned indirectly through exposure to language? Because teaching specific words before reading helps both vocabulary learning and reading comprehension. Extended instruction that promotes active engagement with vocabulary improves word learning. And repeated exposure to vocabulary in many contexts also aids word learning. In other words, children need to see words in many varied contexts and repeatedly in order to really internalize the word, if you will, and make it their own. It is a very different experience to hear a word and be able to parrot back a definition versus learning a word that you can use correctly in context in reading, speaking, writing, as well as listening. Here are a few examples of some specific word learning strategies. Use dictionaries and other reference aids that are carefully selected, specific to the age and the level of the children you teach. Use word parts in your teaching, such as affixes, base words, root words. And teach students how to use context clues, such as in the sentence you see here. There are certainly other word learning strategies that we will explore in future modules. Now, let's take a watch and listen to Professor Curtis of Lesley University in Cambridge. She's going to discuss some of her critical findings about vocabulary development in adolescence. Even if you do not teach middle or high school students, there are still wonderful insights that you can apply to your work with younger and older students as well.
My name is Mary Beth Curtis. I'm a professor of education here at Lesley University, where I also direct the Center for Special Education. For the past 30 years or so, my research and clinical work has focused on how reading develops and what fails to develop or develops differently when students have difficulty with reading. And over the past couple of years, I've been working with students who are at risk for reading failure and as a consequence at risk for dropping out of school. And in looking at those students and trying to figure out what sorts of things they were good at and what sorts of things they were having difficulty with, we were struck in our testing by how many of those students had difficulty in vocabulary. When we think about why explicit vocabulary instruction is important for adolescents and important for teachers of students of adolescents, whether they be English language arts teachers or content area teachers, I always go back to the relationship between vocabulary and comprehension. Vocabulary is also a consequence of how well you comprehend. If you're a good comprehender, you're going to have lots of opportunities to learn new word meanings from context. But if you're having difficulty in comprehending, you're going to have a really hard time learning those word meanings on your own. Direct and explicit vocabulary instruction is certainly the first principle that the research supports. It's particularly important when you're working with students who are learning new vocabulary that they have the opportunity to have the information explained to them directly, to have opportunities then to apply that information guided by their teachers, and then finally opportunities to apply it independently. Another principle that we want to make sure that we incorporate in our vocabulary instruction is multiple opportunities to learn the new word meanings or the vocabulary skills that we're teaching. In addition to these multiple encounters, we want to make sure that these multiple encounters are occurring in varied contexts. An example I can think of is a student, I asked him if he knew what desist meant. And he said, yeah, he said, my high school teacher says that, cease and desist. And I said to him, okay, what does it mean? He says, well, I think it means sit down, shut up, and pay attention. And finally, in addition to direct and explicit instruction, multiple opportunities in varied contexts, we want to make sure that the tasks that we give students to learn vocabulary with and vocabulary skills are very active and generative tasks, that they really have a chance to work with the information, that they're not just sitting there and receiving it as empty vessels, but they have a chance to work with it. And so ways that we can help students to work with this information include discussions, include writing activities, include graphic organizers when they're filling out the information. The key to it is to make sure that there are many right answers, that students know that there's no one way to respond in these tasks. And the research supports that as being a very effective way to teach vocabulary. When we think about why it's important for subject area teachers to provide explicit vocabulary instruction, it often helps to think about the kinds of vocabulary words that are out there. Researchers often distinguish between conversational vocabulary and academic vocabulary. Conversational vocabulary is oral vocabulary. It's the kinds of things that refer to concrete things out there that we discuss on an everyday basis. Academic vocabulary is written vocabulary. It's vocabulary that we learn through schooling, and it's the kind of thing that content area teachers have to teach when they teach their areas, and it tends to be more abstract than conversational vocabulary. Academic vocabulary really we can think of as two different kinds as well. There are these words that people have called brick words, and there are words that they've called mortar words. And the brick words are the key concepts in the academic area. So if we were teaching the different kinds of muscles or something like that, there would be skeletal muscles, there would be cardiac muscles, there would be smooth muscles. Those are really the brick vocabulary words when you're thinking about muscles. But there are also these mortar words that you have to know in order to understand the brick words. So if I was talking about muscles, I would need to know words like functions, because those different muscles have different functions. I would need to know the word characteristics, because those muscles have different characteristics. The researchers Isabel Beck and Margaret McCowan have brought all of those notions together when they've talked about word tiers. They talk about 3 different word tiers. And tier 1 are these words that are basic vocabulary words. They're words that occur in oral language, and they tend to be words that most middle school and high school students know the meanings of. They're words like baby and store and bus and car and things like that. And then there are these tier 3 words at the very opposite end. And the tier 3 words are the domain-specific words. Those are the ones that content area teachers want to teach. That's their content. They're things like isotope and peninsula and quadratic and those sorts of words. And then in the middle there are these tier 2 words. And these tier 2 words are academic words, but they cut across the content areas. They're common to all those areas. And they're words like characteristic and analyze and formulate and things like that. Content area teachers, as I said, teach those tier 3 words. That's their content. But if students don't know these tier 2 words that kind of tie the content together, students are going to have difficulty in understanding the content. So that's why it's so important that content area teachers, as well as English language arts teachers, focus on teaching tier 2 and, if necessary, the tier 1 words, so that students will then be able to understand the tier 3 words. When content area teachers are thinking about the ways in which they can help students understand the words not only that are part of the content, but those vocabulary words that bind together the content, these tier 2 words that help students to understand their content, there's a number of things they can do. Teaching prefixes and suffixes and root words can be a wonderful way for content area teachers to help students. So many of the words in the content area come from Latin and Greek origins, and so it can be especially helpful to teach those within the content areas, because that's where those words are occurring. Also, graphic organizers are a terrific way to help students in the content areas to understand, and showing students how the concepts that they're working on relate to concepts that are already familiar to them. There are so many words, we can only teach so many of them. There are so many skills, we can't teach them all. But we can get students engaged with words and meanings and to raise their consciousness about it. I was made particularly aware of this just a few days ago. Some students were in a vocabulary class, and the teacher said, we decided to take the day off and to watch the inauguration of the president. And so the teacher and the students watched the inauguration of President Obama, and the students got increasingly excited as they listened to the inauguration speech. And at the end of it, the teacher said, well, what did you think? And the students said, I can't believe it. They were so excited. President Obama had used 3 of their vocabulary words in the inaugural address. Now, how cool is that?
Now that you've heard from Dr. Curtis, let's take 10 minutes or so to reflect. Please pause the recording now and find reflection number 1 below. When you've completed your reflection, please press Next.